The Orbiter was originally debuted in 1976 at Dreamworld Margate in the UK. The ride was a product of Richard Woolls and his brother-in-law Bob Nichols, who would joke to the engineer and former ride showman that he should design his own ride with the amount of time he was spending repairing other people's rides. Rides at the time were slowly embracing the new hydraulic technology that was slowly becoming more and more popular. Most new rides at the time were really just old rides slightly enhanced by the addition of hydraulics. A great example of this was the Paratrooper, which was moving from a fixed-in-place version to one with a hydraulic lifting arm. Woolls wanted to create an entirely new ride that would not be possible without this new technology. The first Orbiter completely changed the face of the fairground, bringing it from the past where slower, simpler rides were the norm, and propelling it into the present day. The original Orbiter, made by Woolls' company Tivoli Enterprises, used 6 large, fixed sweep arms. At the end of these sweeps, there was a lifting arm, which was then attached to a smaller sweep arm holding 3 rider vehicles. This gave the ride a total of 18 rider vehicles, each seating 2 riders, for a capacity of 36 riders per cycle. The large sweeps could rotate at up to 18 revolutions per minute, with the smaller sweeps tilting up to 90 degrees and spinning at up to 20 revolutions per minute. This made for a very thrilling and intense ride, especially for the time. The original Mark I Orbiter design had some features that would cause some problems for early adopters. The first was a center pay box, meaning that riders who wanted to pay for a ride on the machine would need to enter the ride area first and go to the center of the ride where the operator was located. The second would be the setup of the floors. Originally, they had to be stacked and rebuilt every time the ride was moved. Finally, the cars were built with folding steps, as without them it would be difficult for riders to enter them. These problems would be solved with the Mark II Orbiter. The Mark II was introduced in 1977, just 1 year later. It moved the pay box to the outside of the ride, it featured folding floors, allowing for easier transport, and most importantly, it featured a new hydraulic system that could lift the center of the ride. This allowed it to lower to the loading position and then rise to a safe position before starting the ride cycle, cutting down on load and unload times by removing the step assembly. The Mark II Orbiter was also more intense, allowing for speeds of up to 20 revolutions per minute on the center sweeps. Many showmen in the UK would build their own Orbiters, with some manufacturing them for others, as well as several small companies forming to build Orbiters in the UK, such as Norsen Power. The Orbiter would end up becoming widely copied by other manufacturers. The Mark II would become the most popular model of the Orbiter, being produced well into the 2000s. The modern Tivoli Orbiter has a few minor changes from the Mark II, including the addition of over-the-shoulder restraints on the rider vehicles and floorless seats. In 1997, Tivoli would introduce the Remix. This would be the successor to the Orbiter, with the largest difference being the ability for the rider vehicles to invert. This ride will receive its own episode in Flat Ride Friday. Several companies like Fabbri have also made Orbiters. With this, the design of the Orbiter has changed slightly over the years. Today, Fabbri sells the Super Orbiter. This ride has the option of being made smaller than the original Orbiter, with the option of just 12 cars instead of 18. It also adds extra thrill by tilting the cars up to 120 degrees, kind of like a Remix. The Fabbri version can be differentiated from the original Tivoli version by looking at the center of the ride. The Fabbri version does not lift vertically in the center. Instead, the entire ride is on a giant hydraulic arm, kind of like an Enterprise. Once at full speed, the ride will tilt up about 30 degrees into the air, making for an even more thrilling ride. Though Orbiters were originally designed to be transportable rides, several permanent versions were installed as well. Today there are only a few park models still operating, with one of the most well-known being Flying Machine at Busch Gardens Williamsburg, as well as another being Honker Dinker Derby at Sesame Place in PA. Both of these rides showcase the Orbiter's flexibility, with both running at lower speeds and reaching a lower maximum angle than the models found at fairgrounds. In this case, both rides are used as family rides rather than as thrill rides. The Orbiter would go on to inspire the Remix, which will be covered in a future episode, but the legacy of the Orbiter is deeper than that. It signaled the end of the fairground that many had been comfortable with in the post-World War II era, and the beginning of the fairground we know today, filled with some of the most intense and thrilling rides you can find just about anywhere. The Orbiter shattered the idea that fairground rides should be simple and more gentle, setting the stage for future rides that would dominate the fairground. The Huss Condor debuted in 1984 at the New Orleans World's Fair under the name Cyclo Tower. The ride would be the newest from what was at the time the most innovative flat ride manufacturer in the world, Huss. The ride was designed to be installed both permanently and to travel on fairgrounds. The ride was a breakthrough at the time, being one of the first tall thrill rides ever produced. Add to that, this ride could be transported, and it was extremely impressive for its time. Keep in mind that when this ride debuted, the average drop tower looked like this. The Condor consisted of a central tower of varying height, but usually no taller than 120 feet or 36 meters. Inside the tower, there was a counterweight, as well as an electric winch that could raise the sweep arm assembly to the top of the tower. Around this central tower sits 4 smaller sweep arms that spin around the tower. At the end of each of these sweeps, there sits a smaller ring of 7 rider vehicles. Both sets of sweeps can spin independently from each other, and the rider vehicles can swing out much like on a Huss Enterprise. The original ride was offered with 2 rider vehicle types, the prototype and the bird theme. The ride can run with a pre-programmed cycle or with direct operator control. If all seats were filled with 2 riders, Huss claimed the ride could process 1,700 riders per hour. The ride would also be innovative for its time, featuring pneumatic locking doors, meaning an operator did not have to go around to each seat to unlock them. This was one of the first rides to have a system like this. The ride was a huge success, with over 30 being sold, mostly in the 1980s and 90s. The original Condor would travel and stop at a few permanent parks. The majority of the original Condors are now closed as they've become hard to maintain as time has gone on. One of the most well-known traveling Condors was Icarus. The ride was known for being one of the fastest Condors in the world, traveling to fairs around Europe. In 2007, the ride was taken off the fair circuit and placed into storage. In 2017, it would be bought by Cedar Fair along with several other classic European fair rides. The ride would reopen at Worlds of Fun in 2017. Unfortunately, the ride would have a rough time reopening, and several maintenance issues meant it operated sporadically at the park. After the 2022 season, the ride was closed, and as of this video's creation in January 2024, the ride is standing but not operating. Most traveling fairs treated the Condor as a thrill ride, running it for longer and at higher speeds, while most parks treated it as more of a family ride, running it slower and for less time. This has meant that Condors at parks have enjoyed a much longer life than those that were traveling. Today, no Huss Condors are known to still be traveling. A few more well-known versions of the model include Flying Falcon at Hershey Park, which closed in 2016, and Condor at Six Flags Great America and Great Escape. These 2 rides still operate, though they definitely move a lot slower than Condors of the past. Huss discontinued the original Condor in 2017, citing low sales and interest. Huss would later reintroduce the Condor in 2013 under the new model name Condor 2G, meaning second generation. This was a modernized version of the ride, mostly featuring quality of life upgrades over the original. The new ride would only be available in a park version. The new ride would offer one major change compared to the original, this being the option to replace 2 of the classic Sweeps rider vehicles with outside-facing seats, like what could be found on a Huss Giant Frisbee. To date, only one has been bought in this model version, opening at Denmark's Tivoli Gardens in 2016. The ride actually has 2 lines, one for the family traditional gondola sweeps, and one for the thrill outside-facing seats. All seats are equipped with a small compartment for riders to secure their loose articles, one of the first rides to ever have a feature like this built in. As of this video's creation, only 2 other Condor 2Gs have been installed, both being traditional setups and both in China, with one at Happy Valley Beijing and the other at Sun Tzu Central Park. The original prototype Condor and the one from Phantasialand were actually converted into Star Flyers after they closed. They can now be found operating at Luna Park in France and Europark in Italy. The Huss Condor is a historic ride that has changed the skyline of many parks and fairs when it was introduced. Today, the original Condor is becoming rarer and rarer, with only a few still operating. The second generation has proven to not be near as large of a success as the original, and it's generally seen as more of a family ride. If you do have a Condor near you, be sure to ride it, as these rides are likely to become rarer and rarer as time goes on. The S&S Scream & Swing made its debut in 2004 at Knott's Berry Farm. Cedar Fair was impressed with the ride and bought another one for Dorney Park in 2005. Both these rides were small compared to newer Scream & Swings, with only 4 riders per arm and only 2 arms. This low capacity caused both Dorney and Knott's to treat these rides as upcharges, charging around $5 per ride. Also in 2005, S&S would create a larger version of the ride and install it at Thrope Park. In 2006, the ride model got even larger with the addition of Skyhawk at Cedar Point, with the ride now seating 40 riders and swinging up to 125 feet or 38 meters. Today, S&S makes the Scream & Swing in 4, 8, 16, 32, and 40 seat versions. The design has seen a few changes over the years that we'll detail in a moment. The original design of the Scream & Swing featured two tall towers connected together. Outside of these towers sat two large compressed air tanks. The center of the ride featured one or two swinging arms. Attached below this was the rider vehicle. The restraints on the Scream & Swings are pneumatic and mechanically ratcheting. They consist of a lap bar with a seatbelt. They are unique in that the restraints both lower on an angle and they lower downwards into the seat base. When the ride cycle is started, pressurized air is shot into a system of cylinders that pull steel cables around each of the swing arms. This creates a loud whooshing sound that is unmistakable to those that have seen one of these rides in person. The original ride only used the same compressed air system to stop. Newer versions feature a retractable magnetic brake under each swing that can help slow rider vehicles and lead to shorter load and unload times. Scream & Swings can swing at up to 115 degrees, leading to a disorienting and airtime-filled experience. Newer versions of the 40-seat Scream & Swing have been slightly enlarged. They now can swing up to 135 feet or 41 meters. This was done at the request of SeaWorld Parks and Entertainment in order to claim the record for the tallest ride of this type. Two-arm Scream & Swings are able to operate with just one arm when it's needed. This can be done for a variety of reasons. This is just one of multiple pre-programmed cycles that Scream & Swings are usually equipped with many having a mild and wild setting, with the mild version offering a less intense ride cycle. Some parks market this, having their rides run more gently in the morning and faster later in the day. The original two Scream & Swings would close in 2015 after declining in popularity. Due to their low capacity, it was not possible to simply make them free attractions, and by this point they were pretty outdated, and at Knott's especially, very out of place. Skyhawk at Cedar Point, however, would be a huge success, and arguably brought the Scream & Swing mainstream in the US. Even today, it's still an impressive ride. Today, Serengeti Flyer at Busch Gardens Tampa is the largest Scream & Swing. It's also one of the newest Scream & Swings, opening in 2023. One of the most common problems with the Scream & Swing is keeping the arms in sync. The arms on two-arm Scream & Swings are designed to swing in sync, with one hitting the peak of its swing in the front at the same time as the other hitting the peak of its swing in the back. This keeps forces on the ride structure more or less even, meaning less wear and tear is experienced. Sometimes these swings can get out of sync, especially if one of the swing's compression system is stronger than the other. This can cause downtime or one-swing operation. It is for this reason that two-arm Scream & Swings usually do not run as intense when running with just one arm. Now, Scream & Swings have had a few notable accidents, both involving parts of the ride flying off in operation. This occurred on both Rush and Skyhawk. With Rush, it was a piece of the metal steps that allow riders into their seats, and with Skyhawk, it was one of the support cables that runs from the top of the swing to near the rider vehicles. In both cases, no one was seriously injured, and S&S issued service bulletins to address the flaw that caused both accidents. The Scream & Swing is now one of the most well-known flat rides in existence, and it's also one of the most thrilling flat rides commonly found at permanent parks. Thanks to recent additions by SeaWorld Parks and Entertainment, there are now more Scream & Swings than ever before. Whether it's a small model with just 4 or 8 seats, or a large model with 40 seats, these rides provide a thrill for anyone. Even die-hard coaster fans appreciate the airtime provided by the Scream & Swing. The Tagada is a simple ride with a complex history. The earliest roots of the ride can be traced to the turn-of-the-century attractions that were essentially just spinning wheels designed to throw riders off them with centrifugal force. This would evolve over time into the Tagada we know today. The modern Tagada is a very dangerous ride. It's so dangerous that it's banned in several countries, including the US and Australia. The ride consists of a spinning disc with seats on the end, facing inwards. The ride has bars behind the seats to help prevent riders from falling out, as well as for riders to hold on to. The seats are not equipped with any kind of standard restraint. Once the ride starts, the disc starts spinning at an operator-controlled speed. The operator can also control a hydraulic below the disc that causes the ride to bounce up and down. The operator of the ride has complete control, making every ride cycle different. The ride has been made by probably hundreds of different manufacturers, and its simple design lends itself well to less experienced manufacturers, often leading to even more danger. The largest established manufacturer of Tagata rides is Technical Park of Italy. Their own website encourages what some might call unsafe operation, stating that, quote, "In Europe, carnivals can be seen sometimes riders are told the ride is over, but the gates are not open and the operator restarts the ride, making everyone fall over before opening the gates. Pardon the broken English." These rides are known for their chaotic and unsafe experience. Riders are expected to hold on to the bars behind them to keep them secure, but with the airtime generated by the bouncing, many riders experience injuries from falling into the seat, then being forced upwards by the upswing from the bounce, with the most common injuries being bruises and broken bones. Many other injuries occur from riders getting up during the ride, which is actively encouraged at most installations. Riders can often find themselves bounced around the center of the ride on their stomach or back, unable to get up due to the motion of the ride. This frequently results in broken bones and bruises. The majority of significant injuries and deaths from Tagata rides have occurred as a result of riders being ejected from the ride. Some models of the ride have lower bars behind the riders, making ejections more realistic. Even with the higher bars, such as the one on the Technical Park version, it's still possible for riders to be bounced out of the ride, with at least 2 deaths being recorded from this happening within the last 10 years, but likely many more occurring. Many wonder why the ride is banned in the United States. One of the biggest reasons is due to it not being ASTM compliant. ASTM guidelines stipulate that rides that experience 0 Gs must have a Class 3, 4, or 5 restraint, depending on how strong the negative G forces are. Tagata rides can best be defined as having a Class 1 or 2 restraint, with the grab bars acting as the restraint in the case of a Class 2 restraint. However, with many manufacturers actively encouraging riders not to use these bars, it could be argued that Tagatas simply have no restraint at all. I made a separate video explaining ASTM further if you're interested. Not all states in the US require rides to be ASTM compliant when they're bought, but most do, meaning that this ride will likely never be found in the US. There are a few variations on the ride that can be found here though. In order to pass ASTM, these rides are smaller and feature seatbelts or other restraints. They're very different than the European, South American, and Asian version of the ride. As mentioned previously, the ride has become a favorite for companies with less manufacturing skill. This can be seen most clearly with Chinese manufacturers, with many unlicensed, illegal Tagata rides being made by very small companies in Hunan province. The ride is ultimately very simple and in demand in Europe, Asia, Africa, and South America. Because of this scattered manufacturing background, it's not very clear who made the first example of a modern Tagata. There are also many different variations of Tagata rides with small changes. For example, some have lower seats. In general, the Tagatas in Western Europe have slowly become more tame over the years with the number of accidents that have been occurring. Asia and South America, on the other hand, still tend to run Tagata rides at full speed, with some rides claiming to give riders 10 minutes of relentless centripetal force and bouncing. These rides are truly up to the mercy of the ride operator. If an operator does not like someone on the ride, they have full control to bounce them until they fall out or break a bone. Tagatas are some of the most dangerous rides in the world, but they also promise a more thrilling experience than just about any other ride, all at a relatively low cost compared to most rides. This makes them a staple of fairs and parks in lower economic areas. That being said, they can still be found elsewhere and offer a ride that cannot be matched in terms of its sheer insanity. On February 6, 1996, Chance Rides filed a patent for a new type of ride that promised to be more thrilling than almost any ride before it, all while being relatively inexpensive and completely portable on just one trailer. Named the Chaos, the ride was based on the design of the Enterprise, which had become extremely popular in the previous 2 decades. The ride would take the basic design of an Enterprise, a spinning wheel on a lifting hydraulic arm, and turn up the thrill. It featured 18 rider vehicles, each seating 2 riders, giving 36 riders per cycle. The ride was a giant wheel with these seats fixed to the end. The wheel would spin counterclockwise at up to 12 revolutions per minute. The 18 seats were able to tilt and spin on their own axis. Additionally, the entire ride could be lifted up into the air 70 degrees by a hydraulic lifting arm, much like an Enterprise. At the top of this arm, there was a separate hydraulic system that could independently control the tilt of the disc the riders were attached to. This meant that the Chaos could be elevated to the top of the hydraulic arm, but still spinning horizontally. On some rides, this could be controlled by the operator, leading to even more thrill. The ride also featured restrictive restraints consisting of an over-the-shoulder restraint as well as a part leg, part knee bar designed to keep riders' legs safely inside the car. This gave the Chaos a low 48-inch or 122-centimeter height requirement. This gave it the flexibility to be both a family ride and a high-thrill ride. With the ride seeming to offer so many advantages as well as coming at a relatively low cost compared to other rides of similar thrill levels, the ride was initially a huge success, with 52 being built from 1996 to 2001. Models of the Chaos were popping up basically everywhere, from fairgrounds to small parks like Michigan's Adventure and Indiana Beach, to huge parks like Cedar Point and Six Flags Great Adventure. The ride was also well received by riders, with many praising its variety as well as no two cycles being the same. In fact, at first the only complaints involved riders who found the ride to be a little bit too intense. But unfortunately, the Chaos would not prove to be as perfect as it promised to be. The ride featured some operational challenges that meant it was challenging to operate for some parks. For example, it had to be balanced, meaning that one side of the ride had to have roughly the same amount of riders as the other in order for the ride to operate properly. If this was not done, the ride would struggle to operate and would experience more mechanical wear and tear. The Chaos had to be balanced with a variance of less than 680 pounds or 306 kilograms from one side of the ride to the other. With a lot of these rides going to small parks with lower attendance that would often not have enough riders to load the entire ride, or who lacked enough operator training, many of these rides wore out quickly. Additionally, several Chaos rides experienced major mechanical issues, some of which caused serious accidents. On June 20th, 1997, Chance issued a service bulletin requiring Chaos owners to rework the wiring leading to the restraint indicator light used on the ride. It was used to show if restraints were working properly and secured. This was due to the wires moving around a lot inside the seat and potentially breaking. On July 7th, 1999, Chance would issue a second service bulletin, this time more serious. It was related to cracks forming on the backside of the over-the-shoulder restraints that could compromise its security. If owners of Chaoses were to discover any cracks, they would need to notify Chase immediately and receive new redesigned restraints. Now, the greatest issue with the Chance Chaos occurred on July 30th, 2001 at Michigan's Adventure. The ride was at its maximum height and swinging at 70 degrees when suddenly the entire rotating ring of the ride broke off the main hub and struck the ground, rolling shortly like it was in a movie. Once the ride stopped and rescue workers arrived, the ride had to be stabilized as it was at risk of falling over and further harming riders. Once this was all done, 33 riders could be removed, with some being trapped for up to 9 hours. All riders thankfully survived, but 31 of the 33 were taken to the hospital. The ride was closed forever and the investigation started. The investigation would eventually determine that maintenance teams at Michigan's Adventure were only inspecting the bolts responsible for holding the rider wheel visually. Over time, these bolts got loose and the lateral loading on these bolts caused them to shear and break. The accident stained the reputation of the Chaos, and very few more were sold after this accident. In 2007, Chance discontinued the model, making replacement parts much harder to find. By this point, several installations of the ride had already been removed, with Great Adventure closing theirs in 2005 after only operating for 7 years. After the ride was discontinued, other parks would remove their Chaos, with Cedar Point removing theirs in 2010. As of 2024, no Chaos rides remain operating. One of the last was Chaos at the Adventure Dome in Las Vegas. Many Chaoses at parks that once had them remain in those parks' ride graveyards, as there was very little interest from secondhand buyers in purchasing the rides. Parts of these rides still linger on in parks they were once installed at. For example, Cedar Point has kept the backdrop of their Chaos and now uses it for a 3-point shootout basketball game on the boardwalk, though the backdrop has now been repainted. The Chaos promised a lot, and for a time it was a hugely successful ride. Today it only exists in the memories of those who got to ride one. In 2019, Zamperla would unveil an entirely new design of ride that would become one of the most popular new rides of the 2020s. The Nebula Z was designed by Zamperla to be extremely visually appealing, featuring 4 spinning arms, each with 4 seats attached at both ends, much like in the style of a booster, where the seats themselves cannot invert. These 4 arms interlock, crossing each other's path as the ride moves. All 4 arms are powered by just one electric motor with gearing in place going to each arm, ensuring they intertwine as designed. These 4 arms are connected to a central hydraulic tower that can raise so that the arms can spin and clear the ground. The ride central tower also spins at around 2 revolutions per minute, with the main arms of the ride rotating at up to 14 revolutions per minute. This generates some airtime for riders, as well as several near-miss moments with the other rider vehicles. The ride is only available as a permanent version. The ride features over-the-shoulder restraints, which allow it to accommodate riders as short as 42 inches or 105 centimeters, making it a great family ride. The ride can seat 32 riders at a time, but due to the ride's design, it's not possible for all rider vehicles to be on the ground for loading at the same time. This makes the ride somewhat like older rides like the Early Monster, Octopus, and Spider. Unlike these rides, Zamperla has a solution available to parks that makes this process a little bit less agonizing. This is the continuous operating mode. In this mode, the ride will start by having the 4 rider vehicles on the ground loaded with riders. The ride will then complete half of the thrilling ride cycle. After about 90 seconds of running, the ride will slow, lower, and load the other half of the seats. The ride will then run another 90 seconds before bringing the first group of riders back to the ground. In this way, the ride is always loaded and operating. Some parks have opted for this operation mode, while others choose to load one side, then switch the ride, then load the other, and then operate. Regardless of how a park chooses to operate it, the Nebula Z offers an extremely visually appealing ride, with a general steampunk theme with large decorative gears placed on the outside of the ride's tower on the 4 rotating interlocking arms. The first ride of this type was installed in 2019 at Zamperla's own Luna Park in Brooklyn, New York. The ride was also shown off at the Industry IAAPA Expo in 2019 and 2021. The ride quickly took off in popularity, with 19 already opening and 2 more opening in 2024. The ride has been a huge success and one of the most successful rides introduced in recent years. Following the success of the Nebula Z, Zamperla introduced the Chrono Z in 2021. This is a smaller version of the Nebula Z that is aimed more at FECs and smaller amusement parks. The ride only has 2 arms instead of 4, meaning that the loading process is much simpler than the Nebula Z. The Chrono Z has a central tower that rotates at 2 revolutions per minute, with the arms rotating at 12 revolutions per minute. Its rider vehicles are 3 across rather than 2, leading to a capacity of 12 riders per cycle. To simplify the ride, the central tower does not raise. Instead, a set of steps folds out from the floor to facilitate loading and unloading, much like a Funtime Vomitron. As of this video's recording in January 2024, no Chrono Z are known to have been sold. The Nebula Z has proven to be the ultimate post-pandemic investment for parks, popping up everywhere from small parks to large, with one of the most notable installations being Mixed at Hershey Park, located in the Cobra Roll for the roller coaster Jolly Rancher Remix. This ride is one of the most scenic Nebula Z installations. Another has recently opened at Carowinds in 2023 in the new Aeronautica landing section, and 2 are set to open at Six Flags Parks in 2024, one at Fiesta Texas and one at Six Flags America. The Nebula Z is a sensation for both riders and non-riders due to its visual appeal. In 2009, Gerstlauer unveiled the Sky Roller, an all-new ride design that scaled a novel concept to new heights. The concept of a ride where riders controlled their experience was nothing new. It had been done several times in the past by different ride manufacturers. But those were all low-thrill rides with riders only controlling how high or low their vehicle went. Gerstlauer wanted to take this idea and scale it into a thrill ride, where riders could control how erratically they moved and even if they inverted. They turned to the design of the Flying Scooters for inspiration, a ride that used a wing controlled by the riders to control how high or low the rider vehicle went, as well as control how fast it did this. Liking the idea, Gerstlauer adopted the idea of a wing concept to their new ride. Named the Sky Roller, riders have 2 joysticks, one for each wing, and if they time it properly they can invert themselves, potentially doing this over and over for the duration of the ride cycle, meaning that every ride cycle is truly unique. Some versions of the ride are even equipped with a manufacturer-designed flip counter that counts the amount of flips each rider gets. The seats are attached to a large set of sweeps around a central tower. Depending on what version of the ride is bought, this tower can range in height from 15 meters or 59 feet to 35.5 meters or 116 feet. The ride comes in 2 seat configurations, one with 16 seats and one with 24 seats. The extra seats are added on the 24-seat version by increasing the amount of sweep arms and decreasing the distance between sweeps. In any version, the riders can control their spinning, rocking, and flipping with the wings on their seat as the ride spins up to the top of the tower. The arms attached to each seat at the end of each sweep arm are also able to swing out with the centrifugal force of the rider's seats. In any case, the entire tower of the ride is spun at the base. Some versions of the ride use a counterweight system to raise the sweep arms to the top like a Starflyer, while others use hydraulics. The ride debuted at Munich's Deutsches Museum in 2008. After a short time at the museum, it was relocated to the Park Belantis in Germany, where it still operates today. The ride was a hit at both locations, and today 6 sky rollers are in operation. A few other notable installations of the ride are Skyhawk at Canada's Wonderland and Teton Monkey at Fuji-Q Highland, both of which are 24-seat versions that are 35.5 meters or 116 feet tall. Both rides also opened in 2016. Following the success of the Sky Roller, Gerstlauer introduced the Skyfly in 2012. The ride at first looks unremarkable, with a main lifting arm attached to a counterweighted ride vehicle arm that can spin it up to 6.5 revolutions per minute and reach heights of up to 72 feet or 22 meters. It uses the same seats as the Sky Roller, this time featuring 12 seats with pairs of wings attached. These seats are free to rotate with the ride and with the control of riders moving the wings. Unlike the Sky Roller, the movement of the Skyfly is more unpredictable, as it does not move in a normal circular motion. Instead, the counterweighted arm will first lift away from the ground using a system much like on a Mondial Topscan. The counterweight arm then begins to spin around on a tilted axis. The arms connected to each seat also swing with this motion, making each seat experience more movement than on the Sky Roller. 3 rides of this type were installed in its debut year of 2012. One at Nickelodeon Universe at Mall of America, one at Nigloland in France, and one at Legoland in Germany. The ride has continued to be popular, with 18 more being installed since then, and 2 more are set to open at Universal's Epic Universe in 2025. The largest problem with this ride model is its low capacity, only allowing for 12 riders per cycle due to the seating arrangement. This has kept the ride out of many large parks, and it's the reason that Universal's Epic Universe is installing 2 of these rides right next to each other. With the successes of the Sky Roller and Skyfly, Gerstlauer adapted the ride design to be smaller and more inexpensive. With this, they introduced the Sky Racer. This ride is much simpler than the other models, featuring just 10 sweep arms that are attached to one winged seat each. A central hydraulic system raises all sweeps at the start of the ride, and the ride spins. As this happens, riders are free to flip their seat just like on any other version of the ride. The ride is less thrilling than the other 2 versions, as riders stay near the ground and travel at lower speeds, so the effects of the wind are lower. So far, only one Sky Racer has been installed, and it can be found at Tivoli Friedheim in Denmark. All 3 versions of the ride have been praised for being thrilling or mild, while giving the rider full control over their experience. Some riders claim to be able to flip themselves over 50 times in a normal ride cycle. Gerstlauer encourages this by offering an optional flip counter on all of these rides so that riders can see how many flips they perform. In any case, the ride has been a winner for parks that have installed it in every aspect other than its capacity. Even the 24-seat Sky Roller is relatively low capacity compared to other tower rides. The Technical Park Moondance debuted in 2005. This ride featured a large rotating disc where 24 riders were seated facing outwards. The disc is attached to a counterweighted rotating arm that itself is attached to a hydraulic that allows it to lift up to an 80-degree angle. The original Moondance featured 24 seats with over-the-shoulder restraints. The seats were slightly inclined to reduce stress on the rider's shoulders and back. The ride was loosely based on the rare Fabry Contact, which debuted in 2003. The Contact did not rotate at nearly as high of an angle, and it featured seats mounted on their own individual hubs. The Contact also featured 32 seats. The Contact is now discontinued, but Technical Park continues to make the Moondance and its later variations, though only one original Moondance design has been sold. The original Moondance needed 2 trailers to be transported. This meant it was limited to larger showmen who had the staff and vehicles required to transport and assemble such a ride. It was also known to have a longer assembly time than most rides due to its large size. Based on this, Technical Park introduced the heavy rotation in the late 2010s as an alternative to the Moondance. This ride turned the outward-facing seats around, while reducing the overall diameter of the disc that rider seats were placed on. This also meant a reduction in the number of seats from 24 to 20. The heavy rotation was much easier to transport than the Moondance and has far surpassed it in popularity. The heavy rotation has gone on to become the most popular ride model of this type, with the only originally manufactured Moondance actually being converted into a heavy rotation. This ride, originally named Dreams Live, which toured in France, was converted into a heavy rotation around 2017. The ride was renamed to Reactor, and it now travels in the Netherlands. Interestingly, though the seat's direction was changed, the diameter of the main disc was not, meaning this is the only heavy rotation with 24 seats. The ride is known for its intense cycle. The heavy rotation rides are generally regarded as being a little bit more intense and more comfortable than the original Moondance. The change of the seat position prevents riders from being pushed forwards into the restraints, instead pushing them back into their seats. This also allows the heavy rotation to rotate slightly faster than the Moondance, increasing its intensity further. Recently, Technical Park unveiled a new concept for a variation of the ride, called the Heavy Rotation Stunt. This can be retrofitted onto existing heavy rotation rides or built from the ground up. The new version of the ride introduces free-spinning seats, adding to the intensity and making the ride somewhat kind of like a flipper ride. So far, none are known to have been built. All versions of the ride are known for their intensity. In most versions, operators also have full control of the ride cycle, giving them the ability to sync the ride to music and effects. The ride can also perform several different movements, such as lifting, spinning the rider disc, and spinning the main arm. This gives operators a lot of choices and can allow the ride to be used as a family ride or as a thrill ride, depending on what the owner desires. This also allows every ride cycle to be different. When the main arm rotates in the same direction as the rider disc, the ride can be made less intense. When they spin opposite of each other, the ride is more intense. A few examples of the heavy rotation are Mr. Gravity, which travels on the German fair circuit, and Magica at Linnanmäki in Finland. The only Moondance that was ever created, as mentioned, was converted into a heavy rotation, but it still features more seats than the stock heavy rotation and is said to give a better ride by many who have ridden both. The KMG XXL is one of the most iconic new Midway rides. It's described by KMG as the big brother to the Afterburner and Freakout. This description is accurate, as the XXL is over twice as large, with a maximum height of over 40 meters or 131 feet, and a maximum swinging height of 45 meters or 147 feet. It can swing up to 120 degrees. The ride is huge, especially for a traveling ride. Even with its impressive size, the ride can still be transported on just 3 trailers, and needs a setup time of just 6 or 7 hours with 4 people. Impressively, the ride is self-assembling, meaning a crane is not required to build the massive attraction. The ride is available as a permanent version or transportable. The ride model is claimed to pull over 5 Gs, making it one of the most intense rides in the world. The ride model is unique in that operators can choose to set up the seats facing inwards or outwards depending on their needs and preferences, though the inside-facing seats have proven to be much more popular. Every XXL comes with 20 seats broken up into 4 rider vehicles with 5 seats each. It also features a folding lowering floor. The ride is massive, but it's actually no longer the largest traveling pendulum ride. That record goes to the KMG Inversion 24, which can reach a maximum height of over 60 meters or 200 feet. This ride has been covered in a past episode of Flat Ride of the Week. The first KMG XXL was sold to a Dutch showman and first toured in 2006. It would then be sold to several German showmen before finally ending up with German showman Zinecker, who still travels with the ride today under the name XXL. As of this video's creation in March 2024, 7 XXLs are known to exist, with 2 more set to debut later this year. 4, including the original, are traveling in Germany, 1 is traveling in Belgium, 1 is traveling in Australia, 1 permanent version is located in Canada, and 2 brand new XXLs are set to debut in the United States later this year. The Australian ride, named the Beast, first showed up in 2016. It's the largest pendulum ride in the Southern Hemisphere, and it's been a huge hit. The owners of the ride are clearly very proud of it, as they have uploaded tons of footage of different angles of the ride, much of which has been used for this video. Playland in Canada is home to the only permanent XXL at this time, opening in 2015 and named simply Beast. The ride is a huge part of Playland Skyline and is currently the largest pendulum ride in Canada. The ride is visually different from the traveling version, as the support arms do not have any brakes in them. Instead, they are solid steel, as the ride does not need to fold down. In my opinion, this makes the ride look slightly less impressive, though the actual ride experience is theoretically the same as the traveling versions. 2 KMG XXLs are said to be coming to the United States in 2024. 1 to Iconic Midway, otherwise known as Wade Shows, who usually travels on the East Coast, and 1 to Butler Amusements, who usually travel on the West Coast. Iconic Midway bought the ride in 2022 and has been teasing its arrival ever since then. The ride was set to debut at the South Florida Fair in West Palm Beach, Florida in early 2024. Unfortunately, shipping delays have led to the ride being delayed. At this point, it's not known when the ride will make its debut. The ride is set to be named XXL and will travel with Iconic Midway's other rides, as well as on its own circuit to venues that are looking for one giant iconic ride. Butler Amusements has not shared near as much about their new XXL, other than that it will debut sometime in 2024. It's very possible that by the time you're watching this video, both rides have already made their debut. It's hoped that both rides are a success, as they would be the first major new ride model on US fairs in some time. The KMG XXL is an amazing ride to watch, whether it be setting up or running. The ride is an engineering marvel and an extremely thrilling ride to boot. I am personally excited to hopefully get the chance to ride this attraction this year, and I hope that it's a huge success. What's even more crazy to me is that KMG was still a new company when they designed the XXL. They have quickly grown to be a giant in the industry, and we'll learn a lot more about their history in episode 11, just 2 weeks from now. The carousel, merry-go-round, or roundabout is generally considered the original amusement ride. The modern version of the ride can be found in thousands of locations worldwide, ranging from amusement parks, museums, zoos, and even cruise ships. It's simply the most recognizable and significant ride ever created. But a ride as old as the merry-go-round has a rich and deep history, and the rides that we call merry-go-rounds today have changed significantly over time. The origin of the carousel is credited to a game which seems to have started around the year 1000. In this game, 2 knights would ride in a circle and toss a ball between 2 of them. This required great skill and was used more as a training exercise before battle. The word carousel comes from the Italian word carosella, which roughly translates to little battle. The game evolved in the 1600s. Now riders on horseback would attempt to spear metal rings while riding. This became a bit of a public spectacle in mainland Europe, and eventually became popular enough that some operations were set up where members of the public could try the game for themselves. Around this time, wooden models of horses began appearing for children to pretend to play the game. In the 1700s, a small industry began to be formed around these attractions. This consisted of what we would now call showman family traveling with attractions and shows by wagon train around Europe. The oldest variation of the modern carousel was born at this time, the live carousel. This consists of real live animals, usually horses or ponies, walking in a circle around a set track together. Some attractions like this do still exist today. This progressed over the next few years into things that seem more like rides to us. The first of these would consist of wooden animals hung from chains, ropes, or wooden poles connected to a center structure. Animals or people would then be used to spin the device, causing riders to swing out to the sides of the attraction. A description of one of these rides exists from 1803. It describes a ride designed by John Joseph Merlin, an inventor from the Holy Roman Empire who set up one of his rides in the Mechanical Museum of London. It's written that the horses floated freely over a pole, and it was connected to a big musical instrument that played a fully orchestrated concerto. From the first note, it was said that the carousel would start turning while each horse would make a galloping movement with a visitor on its back. The carousel would continue development through the 1800s alongside a growth in the amount of leisure time available to the common person. The first record of steam-powered carousels comes from 1861. In this era, carousel-style rides were the amusement rides. So many steam-powered versions were known to run very fast compared to contemporary carousels. In fact, it wouldn't be until the 1930s and 40s that carousels started to transition into more kid-friendly rides. An English reporter in 1863 described one of these steam-powered carousels as, quote, "a roundabout of huge proportions, driven by a steam engine which whirled around with such impetuosity that the wonder is the daring riders are not shot off like a cannonball, and driven half into the middle of next month." These steam-powered carousels were the highlights of any fair they attended, much like the large pendulum rides are today, and they required quite a team and equipment to transport. In this era, English engineer Frederick Savage made several contributions to amusement ride and carousel development. One of his creations was the Sea on Land, a ride mentioned in the Matterhorn video, as this marked the point where the history of carousels and Matterhorn/Himalaya rides split. The Sea on Land was a fast-paced ride that featured boat ride vehicles. Under the boats was a crank mechanism that caused the boats to tip and rock as if they were on the sea. His company would also place this design with the cranks under the rider's seats on normal carousels featuring horses. This type of carousel is known as a galloper, and a few examples still exist today. Savage's company pioneered other advancements, such as a swinging mechanism so horses could swing out with centripetal motion. His carousels were also some of the first to feature fairground organs, or band organs as they are known in the US. These organs also have quite the history themselves. The first fairground organs appeared in the early 1800s and were driven with a hand crank. Their design was similar to that of a music box, where a rotating drum would interact with metal pins, producing sound. These organs were designed to be loud, so they could be heard over the sound of crowds and fairground machinery. Much like modern fairground music, they were designed to attract people and keep them interested. Later versions of the fairground organ would work by having a steam or electrically driven bellows that blew air through holes in a paper scroll. This works very similarly to a player piano. Now, many of these later organs were designed to be run on electricity. That is the case with this example here at the Merry-Go-Round Museum. Now, many amusement park organs were modified later on to run digitally, often using MIDI files such as the ones you've been hearing throughout this video. This one here at the museum, though, still runs with its original paper roll design. The modern carousel we know today was not born in Europe, though. Instead, it would be immigrants in the USA who would bring the carousel into the modern era. One immigrant, a German named Gustav Denzel, would essentially bring the carousel to the United States, and by virtue is responsible for the birth of amusement rides in the country. Denzel was born in Prussia in 1848. He would travel with his dad, who operated a portable carousel. This was a very early example of the German traveling showman families that are so well known today. He would learn wood carving and be sent by his family to the US. Once here, he started traveling with a homemade carousel. It was so popular that he founded a company to produce them. The Merry-Go-Round Museum actually has the original sign from the Denzel shop. If you look closely, you can actually see the painted over word cabinet. This is because he originally went into business creating cabinets before carousels became popular. Before the company was sold to Philadelphia Toboggan Company in 1928, it's believed that over 150 carousels would be produced by them. It would be Denzel's company in the late 1800s that would bring the carousel mainstream with its modern design. Denzel's design, seen on this Alan Herschel model, consists of a crankshaft connected to each horse and back to a gear near the center pole. It's then rotated by the motion of the ride, causing the connected horses to gallop. This design can also be made with a balance section so that horses nearby those that are galloping do not gallop at all. Alternatively, it could be made with a shorter crankshaft, so that way the horses on the outside of the ride did not gallop at all. That's the configuration these two Denzel horses were originally in on their original ride. The American carousel also turns clockwise rather than counterclockwise as commonly seen in Europe. It would be this general mechanical design that would stick and become the carousel we are all most familiar with today. The general mechanical design of this version of the carousel can be compared to that of an umbrella. The carousel consists of a center pole supported by an A-frame. The center pole suspends the rest of the ride. Outwards from the center pole are the sweeps. These extend outwards from the center pole to the edges of the ride. Attached to them at the top of the ride are decorative rounding boards. Often these feature shields as added decoration. Suspended from the sweeps are drop rods that hold up the platform. Often braces are used for extra support. On the platform itself can be a variety of places for riders. These can include chariots, which seat multiple people and do not move up and down, standers, which are animals that do not move up and down, and jumpers, which are animals that do move up and down. Traveling carousels also feature mud stills. These are basically just poles that stick outwards from the A-frame and center pole. They help support the ride when it's set up in muddy locations. The entire machine is driven near the center pole, and the operator may be stationed in the middle of the ride or outside of it. Some people have claimed that there is a difference between a carousel and a merry-go-round. After looking back at the historical record and asking experts at this museum and the New England Museum, it seems that this was really just down to semantics and there's no actual difference between the two rides. The explosion of the American carousel meant lots of competition. This led to the development of different styles that can still be found today. It's important to remember that up until very recently, all carousels featured wooden horses, which required hundreds to thousands of hours of work from skilled craftsmen, meaning that these rides are often seen as art pieces. This unfortunately has had some negative effects that we'll talk about later. Densel's company would develop the first subcategory of carousel style, known as Philadelphia style. Carousels in the Philadelphia style are known to have animals with lots of realism and detail. Carousel manufacturers Philadelphia Toboggan Company, E. Joy Morris, D.C. Muller, and Densel were some of the primary producers of rides in this style. The next style was pioneered by Charles Loof at Coney Island. This style, known as the Coney Island style, is known for being the most flamboyant, with horses and other animals being decorated in glass jewels and gold leafing. Some examples of rides in this style even feature horses with electric lights embedded in them. Finally, we have County Fair style. This style was created by builders in North Tonawanda, New York. In the early 1900s, the area had become a hub for traveling carousel manufacturing, with Armitage Herschel, C.W. Parker, Herschel Spillman, and Alan Herschel building rides in this area. County Fair style carousel animals are designed primarily for travel. They lack the heavy details that the other styles possess. Over time, all carousel horses have a tendency to become less detailed. When they are originally carved, they're filled with tons of intimate details added by master craftsmen. But over time, they get painted with what's called park paint. This is paint applied by a parks maintenance team and usually is of much less quality and much less intricate design than they were originally carved. Though we have now described the most popular version of the carousel, innovation did not stop. In the early 1920s, a racing version of the carousel was created by the company Pryor & Church. This ride featured a new wheel and rail mechanism underneath the platform that moved the horses back and forth to simulate racing. These rides also ran faster than normal carousels. 3 of these rides still exist today, with one at Cedar Point, one at Blackpool Pleasure Beach, and one at Rye Playland. All 3 installations of the ride that remain are mostly true to their original design and are a significant part of carousel history. As time continued, the high skill required to carve carousel horses began to limit their production and increase costs. This became a serious problem during the Great Depression, and it spurred innovation. Alan Herschel invented the half-wood, half-metal carousel animals in this time. These would have wooden bodies that were simple to carve, with metal legs and heads. By the 1950s, new carousels were made entirely out of metal. Alan Herschel's company would be bought by Chance Rides in this time, and a new company, Arrow Development, yes, that Arrow, started making metal carousels. In the 1960s, a man named Dave Bradley started experimenting with fiberglass, casting his carousel horses to make copies. Chance picked up this idea from Bradley, getting permission to use his work. Next thing you know, fiberglass carousels became the norm. Today, many carousels have switched to fiberglass horses or animals, as it's both lighter and easier to maintain. This is the case for the armored horse on the Kiddie Kingdom carousel at Cedar Point. The story of this machine is quite interesting, as it is a Denzel machine built in 1924. It ran with all wooden horses for a long time, even having its armored horse featured on a 1988 series of postage stamps featuring carousel horses. Of all the horses featured, the only horse still on an operating ride was the one at Cedar Point. That led the city of Sandusky to hold a gathering to celebrate the stamps. They decided to hold this gathering at what was, at the time, an abandoned post office in downtown Sandusky. They hoped that 200 people would show up, when in reality 2,000 showed up. After this, a nonprofit was formed and the Merry-Go-Round Museum would become a permanent feature of downtown Sandusky. The Kiddie Kingdom Carousel has now had its wooden armored horse replaced with a fiberglass replica. The armored horse pictured on the stamp is still at the park. It was previously held in the Town Hall Museum and is currently in storage. The advancement of fiberglass carousels did not mean the complete end for wooden carousels. Art Ritchie and Jim Jones founded Carousel Works. Carousel Works is to wooden carousels what DIN is to wooden coasters. Except Carousel Works are fantastic, and their machines are known for their quality. Their company is credited with starting a new golden age of carousels. Carousel Works produced over 60 carousels until they closed in 2021. Almost every major zoo in America has a Carousel Works carousel. These are hand-carved wooden carousels. But the new golden age didn't just include Carousel Works. Many communities, like Sandusky, came together and started carving their own carousel animals or building their own carousels. At the Merry-Go-Round Museum here in Sandusky, animals are still being carved today, such as this ghost over here. One of the wood carvers is actually Paul the Woodcarver, who fans of Cedar Point know for being the Cedar Point woodcarver. Several carousel games emerged over the years, inspired by the actual horseback riding the carousel was based on. One of these was the Brass Ring game, a game where riders are expected to reach from the ride to grab a ring. If the rider gets the brass ring, their ride is free. Knoebels actually still operates their carousel in this way. Though simple machines, carousels do have some mechanical issues that owners need to stay on top of. Bearings exist inside the center pole to allow it to rotate but not lean to one side. These can be damaged if they're not maintained or if a ride is run unbalanced frequently. Riders stepping onto or off of a carousel while it's moving can also damage these bearings. Replacing these bearings is a large process that can take days. There have been a small number of accidents associated with carousels. In 1948, at Cincinnati's Coney Island, a rider fell from a horse due to suffering from a dizzy spell on the ride. The rider would end up dying from their injuries. Another interesting accident occurred in 1919, when a Barnstormer plane crash-landed on the canopy for traveling PTC Carousel number 40. The photo from after the event is quite striking, but thankfully everyone, including the pilot, walked away unharmed. This carousel, PTC number 40, was built in 1917 and is rumored to still be intact somewhere. So if you have any information, feel free to contact me or your local carousel museum. That leads me on to the next part of this video. Carousels are actually endangered, and without your support, they could disappear in the not-so-distant future. The amusement industry expanded rapidly in the US in the interwar period. After the Second World War, it began to shrink. As parks began to close and carousels were sold off, wealthy collectors began buying individual horses for their own private collections.
During the golden era of carousels, over 3,000 carousels were built. Of those, there's fewer than 150 still in existence. During that time period, as you would sit on the animals, you would rub the paint off, so maintenance guys in the park would go put new layers of paint on the pieces. It's not unheard of for carousel animals to have 20 to 30 layers of paint on them. When that happens, a lot of the details in the carvings get filled in and lost. So like any antique that is in its original paint, you do absolutely nothing to it. You ruin the value of it. However, if they've got all those layers of park paint on them and you get them properly restored, so these have all been stripped back down to their original base of raw wood, and get them properly restored, you can actually increase the value of the piece. Most carousel pieces have been restored at some point in time. Collectors can choose whether to restore them back to the original colors that were used. However, most of those pictures, if you can find one of the pieces, are in black and white, so it is extremely hard to tell what colors were actually used, so they can pretty much paint them however they want. When being restored, a lot of them will reflect the time period in which they were purchased and the artistic movement moving through homes at that point in time. As a result, a lot of carousels were dismantled and sold piece by piece, as carousel collectors could purchase a single animal for up to $1 million. When carousel operators could finance parks or their traveling circus or festival when having financial difficulties by selling off a single piece, a lot of pieces would get sold off, so carousels themselves would get broken apart over time. A movement has gone through since the 1970s trying to stop the singular sale of carousel animals as individuals and keeping entire machines as intact, as each machine has its own unique personality and a lot of memories are attached to each individual machine.
Thankfully, in the 1970s and 80s, efforts were organized to save the carousel. This included projects like opening the Merry-Go-Round Museum in Sandusky and the opening of the Carousel Museum in Bristol, Connecticut, along with several other projects. I mention both of these museums as they've both been great resources in helping with this video. Without them, this video could not have been made. If you're in the area for either museum, be sure to stop in. The museum in Sandusky is almost within view of Cedar Point, so if you visit there, you have no excuse not to stop by. Museums like both of these keep carousel history in the public view and out of private collections. Ultimately, carousel history is the history of the entire amusement industry. Without them, the amusement and theme parks of today would likely not exist as they do now. If you're a fan of the industry, you owe it to yourself to help preserve them. I personally will be spending more time helping out at the Sandusky Merry-Go-Round Museum in the future. Truthfully, there's still something special about a ride on a carousel. The Miami is a hugely successful ride that has had a massive impact on the flat ride industry. The ride emerged as a result of the forces at play in the European fairground scene in the early 1980s. At that time, the industry was dominated by a few German super manufacturers like Schwarzkopf, Huss, and Zierer. In this scene, small showmen and mini manufacturers were desperately trying to produce rides that could compete with the offerings of the much larger companies. The first ride that can be traced to the history of the Miami debuted in the early 1980s and was essentially a modified version of a flying carpet ride, with forearms that could tilt independently, allowing for a more erratic ride. No footage is known to exist of this ride, and it vanished after a few years. Around 1982, development began on a larger version of the ride. This would result in the 101 Knox ride, originally featuring 2 lifting arms instead of the one we're familiar with today. This would evolve with time and eventually become the Huss Rainbow. While most of the industry was focused on the arrival of the Rainbow-style ride, a Dutch showman, the Kroon family, bought one of the early prototypes for the Rainbow that was more similar in the design to the flying carpet. The ride would be modified by the family to add seats facing outwards and change the ride to only use 2 arms instead of 4. The new ride would debut on the fair circuit in the late 1980s and was a huge success. With this new success, the Kroon family found orders pouring in from other showmen to produce the ride for them. Due to this, the Kroon family founded KMG, now a well-respected ride manufacturer, to produce the new ride, now commonly called the Miami Trip. KMG would produce their first ride, the first production Miami Trip, in 1988. From this point on, the Miami would become even more popular. The ride has been liked globally for being thrilling while also being easy to transport. The ride itself is contained on just one trailer, both in the US and in Europe. Some showmen have stated that the ride practically folds itself up for transit. KMG states that the modern version of the Miami, now called the X Factory, can be set up in just 1 to 2 hours with 2 people. This design also lends the ride well to artwork, with most Miamis having their counterweight arms hidden by a backdrop. This provides a great blank canvas for artists to place their work. Accordingly, Miami rides have become known to have some of the best artwork found on the fairground. Miamis have been built by tons of different manufacturers. In this video, we'll mention a few of the more prominent ones, but we simply cannot cover them all. Additionally, many Miami rides have been built by independent showmen. UK and now US-based ARM would be one of the first to make their own version of the ride. At first, these were near exact clones of the KMG version, but they would evolve in later variations. Today, ARM no longer produces any kind of Miami, but they still use the gondola from the Miami on their full tilt ride. The Nottingham UK Company, or NUK, became extremely well known for their Miami rides. They produced over 50 Miamis in nearly every UK-based Miami. They also introduced the Suspended Miami, a version of the ride with no floor. This was introduced in the 1990s. Italian ride manufacturer Technical Park has unsurprisingly made their own version of the Miami. Featuring 20 seats instead of the traditional 18, their ride is called the Super Miami. It comes in both permanent and transportable versions. Their version of the ride features a rather high height requirement of 55 inches or 140 centimeters, making the ride more of a thrill ride than a family ride. The Technical Park version of the ride also does not hide the counterweights behind the backdrop, making it easily identifiable. Italian manufacturer Zamperla has also created a modified Miami for children, called the Crazy Bus. This has become one of the most popular children's rides of all time. Several Eastern European companies have also introduced their own version of the Miami, many of these featuring tire drive systems instead of the direct gearbox drives like Western European versions. This makes them cheaper, but also less thrilling and in some cases less safe. Finally, American/Chinese manufacturer Wisdom Rides at one point made a Miami. This was of similar design to the Technical Park version. They have since stopped production, but it's likely they'll resume production now that they've partnered with Jinma Rides to sell their rides in China. Southeast Asia has not seen the Miami craze that Europe and the US has seen, so it's likely to be a place where this ride model will sell. KMG has not sat idle while other manufacturers have innovated on their ride design though. They've improved the original Miami trip design over the years. The first upgrade came in the mid-2000s with the X Factory. This came with a more efficient drive system as well as individual lap bars for each rider instead of over-the-shoulder restraints. Eastern European manufacturers were the first to produce Miamis with lap bars, but these were single lap bars for a group of riders and they have proven to be somewhat unsafe. KMG also introduced the Parajump at some point in the 2000s. This ride uses the same basic design as the X Factory, except the counterweights are in front of the backdrop and there are 3 arms instead of 2. The largest change though is the seats, with the ride using 3 sets of seats taken from the KMG Speed, a booster style ride. This is designed to give riders a feeling of jumping and flipping. The ride is also easy to transport much like the X Factory, though it is a little heavier. The ride's capacity is also reduced to just 12 riders due to the seating arrangement. There have been a few Miami ride accidents, the most prominent being rider ejections. KMG designed versions of the ride are perfectly safe. However, several Eastern European versions of the ride feature a single lap bar for all riders that locks in just one position. Many of these lap bars are only secured by a simple pin mechanism. This means that occasionally, due to ride forces, the single lap bar may become unlocked. This has resulted in riders being ejected off the ride, causing serious injuries or even deaths. Videos of these incidents do exist, and I have one linked in the description. Overall, the Miami is one of the most successful ride designs in the last 30 years. From its original version with over-the-shoulder restraints, the ride that founded KMG, to the modern version made by several manufacturers, the Miami is sure to be a common sight on fairgrounds for years to come. The Zierer Starshape is a giant ride. The ride first debuted in 2003 at the German Oktoberfest with showman Kaiser. Named for the shape of the arrangement of the rider seats, the Starshape was made to be a highlight ride at any fairground or park. The ride consists of 6 5-person rider vehicles arranged similarly to a Mondial Topscan, attached to a huge counterweight arm that's around 28 meters or 90 feet long. This arm is connected to an A-frame and a platform. This design allows the ride to be transportable or permanent, though due to its larger size, it's cumbersome to transport and not practical to transport in the US. The first park version of the ride was installed at Blackpool Pleasure Beach and named Bling. The ride opened in 2004 and operated until 2011. It was then moved to Skyline Park in Germany, where it operated as Skyjet until 2019. It was then sold to Fantasy Island in the UK to open in 2020 as Turbulence. The ride unfortunately never reopened and is currently in storage. One other star shape still exists in the UK. Known as Air, it travels with the showman Abby Danter. It can usually be found at Hyde Park Winter Wonderland. The ride has been traveling since 2011. In 2015, the first permanent version of the ride was built, Mechanica at Liseberg in Sweden. All previous versions of the ride were transportable models, though some were installed at parks. The major difference between the transportable version and the permanent version of the ride is the base. The transportable version features a temporary base with platforms that can be disassembled, while the permanent version is secured directly to the ground with concrete footers and features a non-disassemblable base. Another permanent version would open in 2019 at Parc Spirou in France, named Vive Bulgras. A new traveling version would also open that year at Duna Fantasia in Indonesia. At least based on photos, this could actually be a permanent version. The newest star shape is Star Voyager at Marineland in Canada, added in 2022 and serving as Marineland's newest ride in quite some time. Star Voyager is also currently the only star shape with 5 rider vehicles instead of 6. This limits the ride's capacity to 25 riders per cycle. This was likely done to lower costs to fit in with Marineland's tight budget. Currently, Star Voyager is the only example of a star shape in North America. Star Voyager was designed as a permanent ride, being bolted to concrete footers. The star shape is known to be a very thrilling ride due to the number of movements it can perform. The main arm can rotate, sending riders from nearly 100 feet in the air to the ground in seconds. The star-shaped section of rider vehicles can spin independently, and each individual rider vehicle can rock and spin like on a top scan. This disorients riders and also ensures that every ride cycle is a little different. The ride features redundant hydraulic over-the-shoulder restraints and can be offered with a spectacular lighting package. This makes the ride stand out in the skyline of any park or fairground that it's installed in. Combine this with the ride cycle's intensity, and this ride can easily be one of the signature rides of any park, much like a roller coaster. The Star Shape is currently the only major thrill ride built by Zierer, and it's definitely an impressive ride.
The history of antique car rides can be traced to the iconic American ride manufacturer Arrow Dynamics. Arrow had been founded by a group of veterans after the Second World War. They would open a small machine shop in Southern California in the late 1940s, producing absolutely anything that was in demand. One thing they found early success in was the production of replacement parts for imported cars.
The Fiat Topolino was one such car, an import that was very hard to find replacement parts for in California. Arrow would start producing replacement parts for the car in 1948. That same year, they would also start producing carousels and children's rides. Those who have watched the episode on carousels know that this time was the very end of the carousel golden age, and so the carousel was still seen as the main attraction at most parks, much like roller coasters are seen as today. Arrow would combine these two sides of their businesses in the late 1940s and produce a children's carousel that used rider vehicles designed to look like small cars. Arrow employees would later state in interviews that these rider vehicles were just modified bumpers from a Ford welded together, with a seat and a fake steering wheel. The simplicity of these rides meant that a few of these rides actually still exist today. Arrow would innovate on this design and create what may be considered the first car ride, the Arrow Flight. The ride debuted in 1949 and featured small cars powered by electricity supplied to them by a rail on the ground that also served as a guide for the car. These rides operated similarly to the Zamperla Convoy that we're familiar with today, in that the riders were not able to control their car in any way, and it would strictly follow the track. Operators would control each car individually to prevent them from crashing. Arrow would also offer their own theming with the ride, offering a miniature gas station and service area, as well as other offerings. In 1954, Arrow became the first known ride manufacturer to use fiberglass when they experimented with Arrow flight cars made out of the material. The ride would have a decent amount of success. The late 1940s and early 1950s were a huge time for children's rides, with that style of ride essentially dominating the rides market in the US. In 1955, Arrow would open Midget Autopia for Disneyland, the most well-known Arrow flight. A few years prior, they had debuted a larger version of the Arrow flight with guides on the side of the track and that run on gasoline engines, with the ability for the rider to control their car. These would at first be marketed as adult versions of the Arrow flight, and it's possible large electric Arrow flights designed for adults were built as well. It would be this larger Arrow flight design that Arrow would work with Disney to bring to Disneyland with Autopia. The ride had been built at several other parks before this though, including the Santa Cruz Beach Boardwalk. Disney would find that the cars on Autopia were getting damaged quickly, and so they worked with Arrow to implement a similar track system to the Arrow flight, this time using a non-electrified rail that could vary in diameter, giving riders more or less control. In 1963, this modification would be made to Autopia, and the most popular version of the Arrow car ride would be born. This version of the ride featured a small 4-horsepower, 1-cylinder gasoline engine that could propel cars at up to 4 miles per hour. Over the next few years, the ride model would explode in popularity, with over 70 being built at parks all over the world. All older versions of the ride would eventually be updated to the center rail system. This included the models at Cedar Point and Santa Cruz Beach Boardwalk. Arrow would also introduce several different styles, including a hot rod design, made to look like the most iconic cars at the time they were produced. One example of this design is the removed Turnpike cars at Cedar Point, which opened in 1959. Another popular design is the Arrow Flyer. These only featured 2 seats and accordingly had a lower capacity. This was the only design made completely in-house by Arrow. One operating example is the ride at Six Flags Darien Lake. The 2 most popular designs of the ride, however, were the Arrow Cadillac and the Arrow Ford Model T touring car, with both being 5/8 scale replicas of the cars they were based on. These cars were also offered with or without a roof. Cedar Point would at one point have 3 of these Arrow rides, one with the hot rod style built in 1959, another with the Cadillac style, which is now the only operating example, called Cadillac Cars, that opened in 1958, and another called Antique Cars located in Frontier Town that opened in 1969 and closed in 2021. Antique Cars would use the same Cadillac design as the Cadillac cars in the front of the park.
The easiest way to tell the difference between the Ford design and the Cadillac design is by looking above the radiator. The Cadillac version seen here features a larger radiator with no logo, while the Ford design is shorter with a Ford logo placed on the top of the radiator. This example actually came from Cedar Point, though it's not exactly clear which car ride it came off of, as cars were often swapped between the two. After the ride's closure, the car was donated to the city of Sandusky and is now on public display during the spring and summer at Mylander Park near the Jackson Street Pier downtown.
There were several other designs and styles used on the cars over the years. All used the same Arrow chassis with the same basic mechanical design. The engines on these cars would connect to a simple transmission. Some versions of the cars actually featured a reverse gear, but most only featured one gear. From here, power is delivered to the rear wheels. The rides are operated with a single pedal that, when lifted, applies a sort of engine brake. When depressed, they increase the engine RPMs, causing the car to go forwards. The cars are also equipped with a pedal on the side so operators can drive them into and out of the station. Under the cars also sits a pair of side-mounted wheels with a large gap between them. These wheels are what limit the distance the car can travel laterally on the track. This can be narrowed by increasing the width of the guide rail. Arrow would eventually cease production of the cars, leading parks to start repairing the cars themselves. Since the rides were essentially simple riding lawnmowers, parks would make lots of modifications to them. When the original engines eventually wore out, parks would usually replace them with some off-the-shelf engines rather than rebuilding the original. Many of these engines have had speed governors added to them to prevent the cars from going too fast. This mix of different engines causes old versions of the ride to have a problem where some cars will be much faster than others, leading to traffic jams or bumping. The cars are equipped with simple bumpers, but they're not made for strong hits. The ride also did not originally feature seatbelts, but many have had seatbelts added by the parks they're located at. Arrow would focus on thrill rides in the late 1970s and 80s. This would lead to another manufacturer, Gold Manufacturing, out of Winnipeg, Canada, to start making the ride type. Arrow would end up reintroducing the car ride in the 1990s in a last-ditch effort to save their company by refocusing on the family rides that made them so popular originally. But unfortunately, it would not be enough to save them. By this point, Gold Manufacturing had taken over the market and become the de facto manufacturer of the ride. Gold, like Arrow, offers several off-the-shelf designs, but also welcomes custom designs. The off-the-shelf designs include the Model 400, which is similar in design to Arrow's Ford model and comes in 4- and 2-seat versions. The Model 200, which is a Safari Jeep style, and another Model 200 in a Grand Prix style. All Gold Manufacturing versions can be configured with either a 9-horsepower Honda gasoline engine governed to 6 miles per hour, or a 36-volt electric motor. The electric versions have a separate brake pedal in addition to the usual accelerator pedal. The Gold versions of the ride have become popular for parks looking to replace their aging Arrow cars, or parks looking to introduce or reintroduce the ride model to their offerings. Kings Island, for example, had a classic Arrow car ride until 2005, when it was replaced by Backlot Stunt Coaster. In 2019, they would bring back the antique car ride to their park to much fanfare, with a new Gold version installed near Windseeker. Gold does impose some limitations when building rides that parks do have to consider. For example, they permit no more than a 6-degree gradient at any point. Arrow was much more aggressive, allowing steeper layouts. This caused some problems. Even though these rides are extremely simple, there are a number of problems owners have to stay on top of. Both gasoline versions of the ride obviously have to be refueled. This can be done at the end of the day, but if somebody forgets, it's possible for the cars to die while out on the layout. This also means that parks must keep a gas depot near the ride somewhere in the park. They must also deal with refueling this depot. Even when cars are fueled, they can still die randomly out in the layout, especially if their engines are not in the best condition. This means ride operators may need to run out into the ride layout and restart the cars or push them back into the station. Finally, on rides with steep tracks or with overspeed cars, there's a risk of cars jumping the track. I recall a story from a park in the preseason. Now this was in the preseason when the rides were just getting ready and the year's problems were being worked out before the season started. An associate was riding a version of these Arrow cars and it went up a curve out of the station. This was a fairly heavily loaded car. Near the top of the sloped curve, the car stalled out and rolled backwards. The car ended up jumping the rail and ended up in the grass next to the ride. Of course, everyone was okay and it was more funny than anything. But that just goes to show you how some of these Arrow ones were designed and some of the problems these rides can encounter. Antique car rides remain one of the most recognizable ride types out there, and thanks to the work of Gold Manufacturing, they are surely going nowhere fast. No pun intended. These rides remain a classic and fill a gap in any park's lineup of attractions. The Swing Around is a ride called by many names, including BB, Ramba-Zamba, Swing Around, and more. All of these names refer to a type of ride where riders' seats swing out from a central structure with centripetal force as the whole ride rotates. Individual seats or sections of seats are then bounced outwards using hydraulic or pneumatic pressure. The first ride of this design was made by Huss and was called the Swing Around. The ride first debuted in 1969 and would become a mildly popular ride for the company. The Huss Swing Around features 14 seats, which can each seat 2 riders. The seats use a single lap bar that goes over both riders. Some have been modified to also have seat belts. The ride was available as both a traveling and permanent version, though it was much more popular as a permanent installation. Like many Huss rides, the Swing Around is known for having the classic Huss hum when running. The ride model is no longer produced by Huss, but several installations still exist. Some examples are Corn Popper at Six Flags Darien Lake and Clockworks at Canada's Wonderland. Huss would replace the Swing Around at some time in the late 1990s or early 2000s with the BB. This was a smaller version of the ride featuring a redesigned and more secure lap bar, as well as less rider vehicles, only 10 instead of 14. The BB would not be nearly as popular and only a few would ever be built. Both the Swing Around and BB have now been discontinued by Huss, so currently Huss does not offer a ride of this design. Several other manufacturers have produced their own version of the ride though. One of the most well-known examples from other manufacturers is that of Soriani and Moser. Their version is called the Apollo 2000 and debuted in the early 1980s. One of the most well-known examples of this ride is Apollo at Dorney Park, which is often mistaken for being a Huss. One interesting difference on this model is that the rider vehicles lock in the most retracted position for loading and unloading. This is done using the same system that causes the rider vehicles to pop up and down. This allows for easier loading and unloading than the Huss version. Their version also features lap bars that sit slightly closer to the riders. In more recent times, Moser has introduced the Dactylus. This is a smaller version of the ride with only 8 rider vehicles featuring over-the-shoulder restraints and less erratic motion. The ride is also made by default with a dinosaur theme with egg-shaped rider vehicles. The ride can only tilt up to 90 degrees and does so much slower than the older version of the ride. So far, only one is known to have been built. SPF Visa offers what may be the best example of a modern version of the ride. Their model, called the Airborne Shot, comes in an 8 and 10 rider vehicle version. It uses the same familiar pneumatic system to shoot rider vehicles into the air. SPF also offers a version of the ride with a button riders can press to control when they're shot into the air. Unfortunately, several Chinese companies, many of them making rides illegally, have copied the Airborne Shot design and made it in lower quality material or with just less material. This has led to a few accidents in Southeast Asia, with rider vehicles becoming detached and seriously injuring riders. Not surprisingly, Technical Park, known for making just about every flat ride model, has made a version of this ride. Their model, also suspiciously called the Apollo 2000, debuted in 2003, well after the appeal of the ride type had mostly worn off. Accordingly, only one is known to have been built. The ride was called Egg Dance and was sold to Halloway Park in Kuwait. The ride is different from the other versions in the classic style as it features lap bars that come from behind the riders, and it has built-in dividers to keep riders from sliding into each other. One of the newest takes on the design is the Zamperla Griffin. Introduced in 2021 or 2022, the ride features 12 rotating arms around a center structure, each arm having 2 rider vehicles. Each rider vehicle seats 1 rider, making for a capacity of 24 riders per cycle. This also gives riders a separated feeling as all riders sit separately. Each rider vehicle is connected to a pneumatic cylinder that can bounce at up to 100 degrees. These bounces can be programmed to do various different motions, including a wave motion or the traditional alternating bounces and swings. The denser design of this ride also means that riders sit closer to each other, making for some near-miss-like moments. So far, 2 of these rides have been sold, both in North America, with one being Spinvation at Kennywood, which opened in 2023. There are several other designs of the swing around out there, many one-off rides by various different manufacturers. The overall design of the ride is quite simple, and so many manufacturers have tried their hand at making one. The original version of the ride can still be found at several parks today, though it's getting increasingly rare. Though unlike many other Huss rides, the simple design of this ride means it has a tendency to last longer due to lower maintenance costs than other rides made by Huss that are around the same age. The new version of the ride has been a hit in places where low-cost, high-thrill rides are in demand. It's safe to say that this style of ride will be a lasting feature in the amusement park and fair world for many years to come. The Zamperla Hawk was introduced in 1997 as Zamperla's answer to the Ranger style of ride that had become increasingly popular over the past decade. The ride comes in 2 sizes, the Hawk 24 and Hawk 48. The larger Hawk features a second arm that rotates in the opposite direction to the first arm. This helps to balance the ride while also making it more visually striking. The large Hawk can process up to 720 riders per hour, while the smaller version can still accomplish a respectable 480. Both versions of the Hawk feature 4 sections of back-to-back 3-across seats. Most rides feature 2 or 4-across seating, making the Hawk one of the few rides to offer 3-across. The seats themselves feature hard over-the-shoulder restraints that lower automatically. The ride also uses seat sensors to detect the position of riders' restraints and disallow starting of the ride if all restraints are not detected as secure. The arms can spin both clockwise and counterclockwise at up to 13 revolutions per minute. The ride uses a direct drive system powered by an electric motor and controlled by a PLC. The arms feature counterweights, meaning they do not have to build up momentum before inverting riders, though some versions of the ride do. The arms are 70 feet in length, and the seats feature suspended style seating, making riders feel more exposed as their legs are dangling. Combine this with the back-to-back seating that ensures riders are looking at other riders in most seats on the ride, then add the usual Zamperla simplicity, and that's all combined to make the Hawk one of the most popular and enduring Ranger-style rides. They can be found at parks all over the world, but are most popular in the US and Canada. Some notable installations of the Hawk 24, the smaller version, include Screamin' Eagle at Seabreeze, Hawk at Magic Springs, and Vertigo at La Ronde. Some notable installations of the Hawk 48 are Aero 360 at Kennywood, Meteor at Dorney Park, and Lumberjack at Canada's Wonderland. Zamperla saw a lot of interest in the Hawk early on, with 3 being built the year after the ride was announced. One named Hammerhead Shark at Six Flags Discovery Kingdom, another was Screamin' Eagle at Seabreeze, and the final 1998 Hawk was named Hawk and was located at Rockin' Raceway in Pigeon Forge. All 3 of these rides were prototypes and experienced some problems early on. This would lead to downtime and Zamperla technicians visiting the rides frequently in their early years to address problems and make adjustments. This would not be a problem at Discovery Kingdom or Seabreeze, but an opportunistic manager at Rockin' Raceway would end up causing an accident. After learning how the ride worked, thanks in part to Zamperla's frequent visits, a manager at Rockin' Raceway installed jumper wires in the Hawk's PLC control system that overrode the seat sensors that prevented ride startup without all restraints secured. This was done in an effort to increase the ride's uptime. This unfortunately led to an accident in March 2004, where the Hawk started without all riders secured, causing one rider to fall to their death. This would lead to the removal and scrapping of the ride. Outside of this accident, Hawks are prone to one other issue. They can get stuck upside down. The ride's counterweight design means that the ride is not naturally in the load-unload position, so it's just as happy being upside down as it is right side up. This has led to incidents, usually involving power failures where the ride can get stuck for up to 20 minutes upside down. This has happened on Canada's Wonderland's installation as well as Kennywood's, but it's likely happened on others too. Regardless, this is still rare, and in all cases where it has happened, riders were unharmed. The Hawk was one of Zamperla's first thrill rides, and while it was successful somewhat, it's impressive to see how far they have come. The KMG Tango debuted in 2001 and would quickly become known for its disorienting and intense ride experience. As the ride grew in number, it also became many people's favorite flat ride. The Tango is a complex ride featuring a main lifting arm attached to a solid transportable base. At the end of the main lifting arm is a separate 3-prong section of rider seats. Each prong can hold 8 riders seated back to back, making for a capacity of 24 riders per cycle. Each section of seats can also rotate freely. To add to this, the entire 3-prong section can rotate, and so can the top half of the lifting arm. This gives the ride so many different options, and with a manually operated ride, it makes every cycle different. The Tango features KMG's patented stand-up seats that are designed to make riders feel exposed as well as comfortable. Combine this with the multiple axes of rotation, and it's sure to be a disorienting experience for anyone. The ride can be transported on just 2 trailers, and in typical KMG fashion, only takes 4 to 5 hours to assemble with 3 people. It's capable of giving 480 rides every hour. The Tango has been mildly successful, with a handful being built. Unlike most KMG rides, the first example was actually sold to the US and traveled with Reithofer shows. It still actually travels with them today. Another early Tango was sold to the somewhat infamous Amusements of America in 2002. This ride was unfortunately heavily damaged in a truck crash while it was being transported in 2004. What remained of the ride was sold back to KMG, and the ride was rebuilt. The ride was then sold to a UK showman before being sold again to California Carnival, who still owns it and travels with it today. Another Tango was originally traveling around the Netherlands with KMG before being sold to the US to travel with RCS shows, one of the best showmen in the country. The RCS Tango has been featured in my video about the best flat rides in the US due to its condition. Though the ride would never be a huge success, the Tango has won the hearts of many and it remains a popular ride at any show it attends. Though not all who ride the Tango are fans. Many do not like the stand-up style seats as they can be uncomfortable, especially if the ride throws you around a lot. The Tango was popular enough though that Zamperla actually tried to make their own copy, called the Zamperla Shocker and introduced in 2003. Only one was known to have been built and it traveled with Faro shows in the US for a short while. The ride did not feature stand-up seats and instead featured standard Zamperla seats like what can be found on the Zamperla Hawk. Obviously, the ride was a bit of a failure and Zamperla no longer produces it. Today, at least 7 Tangos are known to still be operating, all of them traveling and most of them inside the US. In fact, of the 7 Tangos mentioned, only 2 operate outside of the US. One in France named Star Wars and another in Australia named Skywalker. One major Tango incident has occurred. This happened on the Equinox, owned by Gopher State Exhibitions, while at the Ionia Free Fair in Michigan. On July 15, 2018, the ride experienced some kind of electrical problem that caused it to lower with riders in the inverted position. Only 2 riders were on the ride at the time, and both were rescued within 10 minutes and did not experience any injuries. The ride has since reopened. Other than that, the Tango has had an uneventful record, and has proven to be a well-loved ride. Zamperla introduced the Air Race in 2010 as a completely new and unique ride. The ride is offered in 5 versions that all do the same basic movement. The ride spins clockwise and the rider vehicles attached to the arms that stick out from the ride spin on their own axis, inverting and flipping as the ride spins. The design was made to give riders the feeling of flying an aerobatic plane. Presently, the 5 versions of the ride offered are the Air Race 6.2, 6.4, 8.2, 8.4, and Super Air Race. The 6 or 8 refers to the number of rider vehicles, while the 2 or 4 refers to the number of seats per rider vehicle. The Super Air Race takes a standard Air Race 6.4 and adds a lifting mechanism at the base of the ride that allows it to reach up to 7 meters or 22 feet in height. The Air Race 6.4 is by far the most popular, as not including the Super versions, 30 have been built. The Super Air Race is the newest version of the ride, being announced in 2019, and with 11 already being built. The ride model as a whole has been a huge hit for Zamperla, and looking at the stats, it's easy to see why. The ride in its smallest version can accommodate 288 riders per hour, while offering a very thrilling and unique experience, all at a price of below $500,000. The largest version of the ride costs a little more, but it can accommodate 640 riders per hour, and boasts that riders experience up to 3 Gs of positive forces. This makes the Air Race appealing to both large parks looking for another thrilling flat ride, as well as smaller parks looking for a standout attraction. This has led to incredible sales. As of this video's creation in April 2024, 83 Air Race rides exist, 21 of the smallest 6.2 versions, 30 of the larger 6.4 version, making it the most popular, 9 of the 8.2 versions have been sold, along with 2 8.4 versions. Finally, 9 Super Air Races have been sold. A few notable installations of the Air Race include Aang's Air Gliders at American Dream, which is an Air Race 6.4 that was added in 2019. This is also the only Air Race I've personally been on. Daredevil Flying Machine at Six Flags Fiesta Texas, a Super Air Race that's probably also the best themed air race out there, and Air Race at Fantasialandia in Chile, which is one of only 2 Air Race 8.4s. The Air Race is not known to have any serious issues. It is possible for riders to become stuck upside down due to the counterweight design the ride seats use. However, this is rare and can usually be fixed fairly easily. All of these factors have led to the Air Race becoming one of the most successful rides of the last decade. In fact, with the exception of 2020, Zamperla has sold at least 2 air race rides every year through 2023, starting in 2010. The ride's consistent sales and worldwide installations mean that in a few years, it's likely the air race will be seen as somewhat of a classic ride. A ride like Scramblers are seen as today. A ride that every park is just kind of expected to have. The Trabant is one of the most iconic flat rides of all time. It was introduced in 1965 by American ride manufacturer Chance Rides. The ride was a rotating disc placed on a raisable hydraulic arm. The arm itself was able to raise to around 55 degrees and was able to spin on its own axis. The cone-shaped disc connected to it featured 20 rider seats that could each accommodate 2 riders, making for a capacity of 40 riders per cycle. Each seat featured a simple single locking lap bar. The ride was available in a variety of different themes, including the roulette wheel theme, a generic theme, and a southern theme. It was available in both park and transportable models. The ride would be a hit with both parks and showmen, seeing around 25 sold. Some notable operating examples of the ride include Gyroforce at Carowinds. This ride just opened in the park in 2023 after being relocated from Adventureland in Iowa, where it operated under the name Lady Luck with the roulette wheel theme. The ride was originally installed at Adventureland in 1974, so by the time it was bought by Carowinds, it was in need of serious work as well as a retheme to fit in with the flight-themed area. Carowinds completed this work and the ride is now themed to a jet engine. Though it does run slower than other examples of the ride, it is likely to last quite some time. A few other notable examples of the Trabant include Trabant at Michigan's Adventure, which actually originally opened at Kentucky Kingdom in 1989, and El Sombrero at Six Flags Over Texas. This is actually the oldest operating Trabant known to exist, originally opening in 1965. The Trabant was not without its competitors though. Around 1970, German manufacturer Mack Rides introduced the Hully-Gully. This was a refined take on the Trabant with more theming and a slightly different design. The core of the ride was the same though, featuring a spinning lifting arm as well as a cone-shaped disc seating 40 riders. The Mack Hully-Gully featured a different locking mechanism for the restraints as well as a tilted platform, meaning riders started off on an angle rather than on flat ground like on the Trabant. The ride also featured a backdrop and was offered with a figure in the middle of the cone that could rotate independently of the riders. These rides were visually impressive and well liked. Unfortunately, time was not very kind to them, and they became maintenance nightmares as they aged. Cedar Point, for example, installed one in 1970 and removed it in 2002. Interestingly, the ride was sold to the small park Stricker's Grove in southern Ohio, but it was too cost prohibitive to rebuild and reopen, so the ride was scrapped. Six Flags Great Adventure also bought one, adding it to the park in 1975, then removing it in 1987. Then, surprisingly, they refurbished and rethemed the ride to bring it back in 1993. The ride would finally close for good in 2001 after just 8 seasons of operation since the refurbishment. This is a true testament to how badly these rides aged. A few traveling versions of the ride do appear sporadically today at fairs through Europe. That would not be the end of the ride model's history though. In 1991, Chance Rides would discontinue the original Trabant but introduce the Wipeout. This took the basic design of the Trabant and improved it, slightly increasing the speed that the cone rotated at while adding seats that faced back to back. This did not increase the capacity of the ride as it still featured 20 two-person seats, but it did make for a more exciting ride experience, giving riders the chance to ride backwards. The ride also came with an updated restraint mechanism that was automatically locking, decreasing the load and unload time of the ride. Like the old version, it was available as both a traveling and permanent version. At least 17 would be built between 1991 and 2008. Some notable installations of the ride include Wipeout at Waldameer, which opened in 1995, and Cyclone Sam's at Worlds of Fun, which also opened in 1995. This ride is an indoor version of the ride with extensive theming. The ride model was discontinued around 2020, but none had been sold since 2008, with the last produced example of the ride going to Knoebels. Though the story still does not end for these rides, as in 2018, Chance Rides introduced the next generation, named the Freestyle. Much like the rides before it, it features a center rotating arm as well as a cone-shaped disc for riders. Unlike older versions of the ride, it features outward-facing seats. Due to the higher forward accelerations placed on riders in this seating arrangement, it needs more restrictive restraints. Chance Rides opted for over-the-shoulder restraints in this case. The ride is also smaller with an overall capacity of just 24 riders per cycle, compared to the 40 riders possible in the previous two models. The ride is available in both park and traveling models. The traveling model can be completely transported on just one trailer. So far, only two are known to have been sold, one to Six Flags Great Escape and one to Six Flags New England. Both rides actually replaced older versions of the ride at their respective park, with Great Escapes replacing an original Trabant that closed in 2010, and New England's replacing their Wipeout that closed in 2019. As with any popular ride, there are other manufacturers that have made their own variations. For example, Chinese manufacturer Nanfong has made a modern version of the classic Trabant, and Italian manufacturer SBF Visa has made their own take on the Freestyle, called the Reverse Time. The Reverse Time comes in both a 12 and 24 seat version, making it appealing to FECs. A Reverse Time 24 can be found at the island at Pigeon Forge. There are likely other rides that take heavy inspiration from the Trabant that I have not covered in the scope of this video. It's safe to say that the design of the Trabant has had a large impact on the modern industry that exists today. While many of the original rides are gone, a surprising number of them still exist, and modern variations of the ride are sure to be made well into the future, ensuring that this ride type will have a lasting legacy. The Remix debuted in 1997 as an upgrade to the Orbiter. The ride features a more robust sweep arm set that can lift at a higher angle. These sweeps support heavier rider vehicles with suspended style seating. Many flat ride fans refer to this seating as KMG style, as it's similar to many rides produced by KMG. The ride was introduced by Tivoli Enterprises, a UK-based manufacturer that still makes both the Remix and Orbiter today. In fact, the Orbiter/Remix is Tivoli's most popular product. The ride is available both as a 4 and 6 arm version, with the 6 arm version boasting a better capacity but also a lower maximum angle and speed, making for a slightly less thrilling ride. The 4 arm version of the ride is known for being the most intense version of this ride, featuring faster speeds. The Remix's popularity drew some competition and some drive to make an even more intense ride out of the same concept. This competition caused Soriani and Moser to produce the Speed Flip around 2002. This ride takes the Remix and adds extra thrill by tilting to a completely inverted angle. It's also capable of staying in this position for extended periods of time. This ride features 4 sweep arms around a central lifting tower, much like the Remix. At the end of the sweep arms sit 4 rider vehicles attached in a cross pattern. The assembly of rider vehicles rotates like that on a Remix, but it can also tilt up to 180 degrees, completely inverted. This is thanks to a bulkier lifting design than found on the Remix. The rider vehicles themselves can also be unlocked and locked by the operator, allowing for a free swinging experience that's different every time. The ride truly provides some kind of movement or force in every possible direction. Unfortunately, these movements come at a cost, with new units running for just under $1 million in 2002, roughly double the price of a new Remix. The rides were also bulky, leading to difficulty transporting them and a somewhat uncomfortable ride for some claustrophobic riders. The rides are also much more mechanically complex than the Remix. In 2006, North American Midway Entertainment, or NAME, one of the largest showmen in the US, filed a lawsuit against Moser, claiming that the Speed Flip they had bought was defective due to its complex nature and frequent problems. NAME would seek for a full refund for the ride. This case would be settled out of court, but it would help to limit the ride's success in the US. Zamperla would also produce their own version of the Speed Flip. Their version is arguably more well known. Named the Energy Storm, this ride comes in 2 versions, a 3-arm version and a 5-arm version. Name the Energy Storm 3 and Energy Storm 5 accordingly. These rides are offered both as traveling and permanent installations. The Energy Storm does feature a few other differences from the Moser Speed Flip. It does not feature a central lifting tower. Instead, the rider vehicles sit higher up and feature a floor to ensure rider clearance. The ride also does not feature tilting seats, making the experience slightly less thrilling than the Moser option, but also simpler. This has led to the Energy Storm being a greater success than the Speed Flip. The ride has been especially popular in Asia, both as a park and transportable ride. The rides have been well liked in Asian parks for their ease of theming. This is due to the ride's small size combined with ample space for lights and designs on the ride itself. Both the Speed Flip and Energy Storm are still in production, though the popularity of both rides has certainly peaked and is declining. Both rides are disliked due to their bulky restraint design due to the extended amount of time that riders experience negative G-forces. The non-inverting version of the ride, the Standard Remix, has remained immensely popular. Tivoli still sells new remix rides every few years, and the ride is a staple of the modern fairground. The Remix is the most thrilling ride on the fair for many small to medium shows. The Remix has had one incident. This occurred in 2017 on a model in the UK. During the ride cycle, one of the grab bars on the side of a rider's seat became detached and was flung from an operating ride. No one was hurt, but it was worrying as the bar served as part of the restraint to prevent riders from moving too far laterally out of the seat. Tivoli inspected the accident ride and determined that over time, the bolt under the seat that secured the grab bar could become loose. They issued a service bulletin to all owners to inspect and replace these screws as needed, as well as to drill and use additional fastening points for the grab bars. Since this incident, no other similar situations have occurred. The Remix style of ride remains one of the best the fairground has to offer, and its many variations have given the ride model a lasting legacy, starting with the humble orbiter and evolving into the hallmark of the modern fairground. The legacy and innovation of this ride type is sure to be a force in the industry for years to come. The Calypso was invented by German showmen Bosch and Distel in 1958. The ride was thought up after the showmen had visited the US and seen the successes of the new ride at the time, the Scrambler. The showmen believed that a ride that was more refined could do well on the re-emerging German fairground scene. They secured the name Calypso and set out to make a refined Scrambler, with a more appealing look and more movements. The ride they would end up introducing featured a similar mechanical design to a Scrambler, with a center rotating platform featuring 4 independently rotating arms, each featuring 4 rider vehicles situated on the end of the arms. Most early versions of the ride also featured roofs over the rider vehicles. Unlike the Scrambler, there's no support structure located above the riders. Most of the ride's mechanism is completely hidden under the floor. Many Calypsos still feature some kind of center decorative structure, much like the Scramblers they were inspired by. The most significant ride experience change from the Scrambler, though, was the addition of a tilt for the entire ride structure, meaning the ride's platform sits at around 15 to 20 degrees at all times. The ride also featured much more decoration than the American Scrambler that inspired it. The ride's construction is somewhat like a carousel, in that it's based on a large rotating disc that floats above the base of the ride, using a center pole. Outwards from this sits the hubs for the rider vehicles. These spin independently from the main rider disc. The thrilling ride experience combined with the ride's impressive appearance and portability meant it was an immediate success, and the ride would go on to catapult the restart of the German fairground scene. Bosch and Distel would go on to produce 3 more Calypsos in the late 1950s. In 1960, Mach took over production of the Calypso, paying commission to Bosch and Distel for each model sold, and working with several other small manufacturers to produce various parts of the ride. The increase in production capacity meant an explosion in the number of Calypsos. The 1960s would also see the first Calypsos exported to the US. The first would go to American showman Royal American Shows in 1962. The ride would premiere at the Florida State Fair in 1963 and would be a huge hit. That same year saw the first park version of the Calypso, with this ride being produced by Mach and opening at Kennywood. The ride would retain its popularity through the 60s and 70s, with large parks like Cedar Point buying 2 Calypsos in 1970, one with a standard theme named Calypso, and one with a tropical Polynesian theme named Tiki Twirl. Tiki Twirl would be removed and scrapped in the 1980s, but Calypso would live on, being relocated several times throughout the park. At one point, the ride was even re-themed to Tiki Twirl to commemorate its lost twin at the park. Over time, it would slowly lose theming, including its centerpiece. In 2023, the ride was re-themed back to Calypso, with it regaining some of its old theming elements. The ride, like many US Calypsos, features rider vehicles made by the small German company Bruchsal. Bruchsal Calypso cars are known for being lower profile than their Mach or Bosch and Distel counterparts. The cars were all originally sold with roofs over the riders, but on Cedar Point's version, these have been removed. There have been several different Calypso car themes offered over the years. Additionally, Calypsos have always been known for being some of the most beautiful rides due to their expansive backdrops that allow for lots of lights and art. Several notable Calypsos still exist, such as the previously mentioned Calypso at Cedar Point, as well as Spinnovator at Canada's Wonderland. This ride features no backdrop and has unique barrel-themed rider vehicles from Mach Rides. In Europe, no permanent Calypsos are known to still be operating. However, a handful of traveling models are known to still operate. The oldest of these was built in 1962 and currently travels with German showman Winheim. The ride is still in great condition and is truly a landmark on the fairground, considering its age and significance to the industry. Today, the ride can be found looking nearly identical to how it did when it opened over half a century ago. Another Calypso, which originally opened in 1963 in Germany, is now owned by Swiss showman Steiner and can still be seen traveling today. The ride is also in fantastic shape, though this one has been modernized slightly from its original design. A ride as popular as the Calypso was sure to attract those wanting to duplicate its success. UK manufacturer Lang Wheels made a near-exact clone of the Calypso. They were known to produce at least 2 such rides, with one going to Blackpool Pleasure Beach and closing in the mid-1980s. German manufacturer Klaus, in collaboration with Schwarzkopf, created a version of the Calypso called the Hula Hoop. The ride was designed to specifically not infringe on the design of the Calypso. Only one would be built, and it was introduced in 1959. The Calypso is one of the most recognizable rides of all time. The ride played a large role in growing the European ride industry into the monster it became in the 1980s and 90s. The ride still serves as an enjoyable classic family ride at many of its remaining installations. Thanks for watching this episode of Flat Ride Friday. This has been the final episode for Season 1. Regular channel uploads will resume shortly. Be sure to stay tuned for future updates on Flat Ride Friday. I hope you enjoyed this series, and see you next time.